might have guessed from that intro what we're going to be talking about today. And I tried to do my hair somewhat Wednesday-ish. I don't know. But cheers, happy Wednesday. Today we're talking about the Netflix show Wednesday. I recently just watched Wednesday on Netflix, which is directed by Tim Burton, stars Jenna Ortega as Wednesday Addams from the Addams Family. Now, a couple of things real quick. I did not grow up on the Addams Family. I had seen the old ones, the black and white versions. And then in 2020 is when I actually saw the Addams Family movies starring none other than the wonderful Angelica Houston and, of course, Christina Ricci. So I'm kind of coming at it as a fan, for sure. I enjoyed those movies, but not like a die-hard in the lore. So if you're one of those people, this is going to be a review of the show, but also Pilgrims versus Wednesday. I'm going to be talking about Puritans and the lore and mythology around them, as well as the show, and what I think you should do. Should you watch it? Should you not? Should you care about Puritans or Pilgrims? Are they the same thing? Are they different? Let's get into it. First of all, Wednesday released on Netflix November 24th, I think, sometime in November around Thanksgiving. And it stars Jenna Ortega, who does a wonderful job. I really enjoy her performance as Wednesday. And Wednesday is a teenager, and she's going to Nevermore School for the Outcasts. And it's based off of the Edgar Allan Poe Nevermore. And there's a lot of fun monsters and lore. There's vampires and werewolves and sirens, which I guess are mer people. And then for some reason, like Medusa, snake-headed people. And shapeshifters, and I don't know, there's a plethora of monsters and outcasts and this whole kind of thing. They live in a town called Jericho, which is home to Pilgrim World, which is where we're bringing in the Pilgrims and the Puritans. The Netflix show shows Wednesday going to the school Nevermore after some discrepancies in her past at other high schools, because Wednesday Addams is a lover of the macabre, of the satirical, of the dark, gothic, dry sense of humor, the horrific, the terrifying, and she's a very morose young lady, which is why a lot of people have always enjoyed the show. She speaks her mind. She's not fazed by blood or guts. She enjoys torture, and her family is very strange. If you don't know about the Addams Family, then go look it up. I'm not going to give you all that information. All of that is everywhere you need to look. So this is not going to be an info dump. If you don't know who Wednesday Addams is, well, you can continue watching the show and hopefully get something out of the next part of the conversation, which pertains to us all, especially in the Western Hemisphere, but all over the world. Yeah. So I enjoyed the show. I think that I really enjoyed all of the Tim Burton-y elements. I feel like it could have gone a little bit further with some of like the darkness and the design, but enough of it was there. I mean, Colleen Atwood did the costuming, which I love her. She's one of my favorites. And I think that the writing was really, really well done. As I get older, it's kind of hard to enjoy like teen tween shows. You know, I don't have the same problems anymore. But I think if you were in that age group, then you would really enjoy what Wednesday goes through and what her roommates go through on that level. It turned out to be like kind of a mystery thriller sort of situation where Wednesday had to solve some murders and some crime, and thusly ended up bringing into Nevermore this whole prophetic situation where she was going to have to be battling a Puritan or a pilgrim from 1624 when the town of Jericho was founded, you know, in the world, in the show, is working against time to deduce why she's this girl in this drawing from an old book and why all these things are happening. And so it's very fun. I found it clean. I found comparatively, you know, I mean, there weren't any sex scenes. Yeah, there was teenagers kissing and making out and stuff, but that, I mean, everybody does that, so. And there wasn't any, maybe there was a cuss word, I didn't hear any. And I think that what was the most pleasant about that show is that it steered clear of a lot a lot of the societal crap they were going through. So the show was actually a really nice escape. Imagine that! Film and entertainment being an escape. That would, wow. It's crazy. It makes for a really good show. Who knew? I'm being sarcastic there, in case you didn't know. But I think that even though we have outcasts and normies, we have the people who belong to the school Nevermore that are seen as monsters and everyone's really scared of them in the town. And then we have normies who, some of them are nice, some of them are rude, and there's some animosity. And then there's people in the higher ups of the Nevermore school and the town itself that are just using the tension to profit and have a lot of gain. And I think those issues, I personally didn't feel like those were trying to tackle some of the society issues we're having right now, because that's a very common theme throughout history, throughout life, in your local government, in your local school, and all of that. That is a very common human thing where there are disagreements and there are people who are outcasts and there are people who appear to be more normal or more accepted. And so I think that it painted a really nice picture of that. We had character growth, which was kind of weird, was a little interesting. Like, Wednesday went from being a real jerk, and still quite a jerk at the end, but she did change in her arc just a little bit to kind of accept people instead of push them away. But I hope that doesn't make her lose her edge as being someone very quirky, very dark, very... Dog barking. I'm in a new place, in case you can't tell, and I'm drinking wine because I'm an old lady. Oops, shouldn't have said that. Okay, so that's the show. I enjoyed it. I recommend it. If you like dark and mysterious with a twinge of like murder, sci-fi, a little bit of horror, and like teen shows, I think you'd enjoy it. I think it's a safe watch for family, in my opinion, but you can find out for yourself. It's on Netflix. So that's Wednesday. But what the show brought up for me that I didn't enjoy was the Puritans versus the monsters. And even though the delightful thing about the show was every kind of person could be a bad guy, every kind of person could be a good guy. And it showed that, even though there were people who started off evil, ended up changing and being for the good, making good decisions, and then people who seemed very good made bad decisions and it turned into bad guys. That's all life. That's normal. And it doesn't matter what color of skin you are, because it's very controversial right now that everyone's like, oh, Tim Burton's so white. Well, that's his artistic aesthetic. I mean, The Corpse Bride, and the skeletons and all that kind of stuff. I mean, skeletons are white. And his characters are gaunt and skeleton-like. I mean, it just makes sense. So I don't know why there's being this made-up controversy around the show. And I think it's just an attempt to polarize us. And I think it's an attempt to, sell clicks. And I encourage you not to fall prey to something like that, because the show actually does a wonderful job of painting everybody how they are in where they are in life. These are teenagers that we're talking about here. These are grown adults who've made certain decisions, and their kids make different decisions. And come on, just get over it, all right? Enough. So I enjoyed that. What I didn't quite appreciate is I'm seeing this theme across film, especially on Netflix, that's very... I'll just go out and say it. It's very anti-God and anti-Christian. Is there plenty of room for that kind of content and material? Absolutely. But I want to see some anti-Muhammad. I want to see some anti-Buddha. And I definitely want to see some anti-Hindu gods and anti-Celtic gods. The fact that people only use Jesus Christ's name and the Lord's name and cuss words. The fact that people just consistently dump on Christians and accuse them of all these things. It's getting very obvious, and it's okay to have other opinions. It's okay to diss on people that you've met within a religion that have given it a bad name. I mean, it's not okay to diss on them. You should forgive them and move on. But if you don't know what forgiveness is or how to handle it, I guess that's your response. But I think that it's important to point this out, because It's one thing if it's anti-Christian, like we grew up with in the early O's, and oftentimes they were, hypocritical, which who isn't a hypocrite, to be honest? I mean, yeah, I could go on for a lot of inflammatory examples, but I'm not going to. I'm going to try to get to the rest of my story quickly. But I understand pointing out hypocrites. I understand pointing out people and things, and we want to be able to show contrast and color, and I don't need to defend God, okay? That's not my job. I love him because he loves me and has taken care of me, and I have a relationship with him. It's not a religion. But to point out religiosity as being a problem within Christianity is 100% within Christians' rights and other people's rights. But that's not exactly what I'm talking about, because we're talking about a show. We're talking about society. We're talking about multiple shows that are beginning to really be not just anti-Christianity, but anti-God in general, almost as if they don't even want you to believe that there is a God, but that maybe you're God and everything should be about you and you're the most important thing on the planet and everybody should use your pronouns, live your life, be a part of your fantasy, just you, and that's making you a God, which I'm sorry, I sometimes put myself first, absolutely, probably a lot more. I make a terrible God. I don't think of everybody. And when I put myself in the center of my universe, I make some really poor decisions. And that's just the fact. So I am anti-self-godship. And I don't know who, appointed you as an individual to make yourself God over everybody or everybody's life. So I'm not going to get into too much theology at this point because this is a lot to unpack. I'm really trying to keep this video short. So without further ado, Puritans versus pilgrims. So we all know that history is, I hope you know this, history is nuanced. It's not just black and white. But remember, this is a mathematical and societal fact that negative news, bad things that happen bad in the world spread 6 times faster than good news. So if we take that as a common thing that people have been studying since we've been able to record history, especially within the 20th century and the 21st century, and we apply that to the past, because humans have not changed at all, if we apply that principle to the past, we're going to see an interesting pattern, and that makes us question, where is our history coming from? How is it being delivered to us, and why? People often argue that, well, history is only written by victors. That's not true. You're just reading the wrong kind of history. Maybe, or not kind, but you're only reading one side. Everybody has been doing their best to chronicle what's going on in their lives today, and so did historians of different tribes and cultures. Maybe you just need to read more history and not choke down or swallow whole the history you were given to in public school. So the stuff I'm about to tell you, only homeschoolers really know. Not all homeschoolers, but most. And not all Christian kids, but most are going to know the difference and the importance of identifying the good Puritans and the good pilgrims. Clancy. Versus the ones that Hollywood loves to portray. And it's not just Hollywood portraying them a certain way anymore. People are taking this literally, and they're trying to diss on certain beautiful traditions, Thanksgiving for being one of them, because they are only looking at part of the truth and part of history. So we know that there were people from Spain, France, England, and the Germanic countries that were sailing over into the New World, into North America and South America. And at first, things went on a trade basis, and then people got greedy on both sides and started taking advantage of each other. And the people who were the most advanced typically beat the people who were less advanced. And the consequence of that being war, some genocide, and slavery. But slavery was not new at that point. Slavery had been existing almost since the beginning of mankind. And you can follow back anything but secular textbooks and any kind of religious texts and different cultures and find that people were looking for an excuse to enslave their fellow man from the get-go. And a lot of that comes with making yourself God and making yourself better than people because you know everything. Not you personally listening, but you as a person, somebody out there who makes themselves God, and then all of a sudden they're superior to everybody else. So that's how you end up enslaving other people, is by thinking that you're superior. And that has happened in all cultures throughout history. And slavery existed long before it ended up being in North America. In fact, it was in North America already because Native Americans, different indigenous tribes, were already enslaving each other, some of them eating each other. So we didn't walk into an avatar world or a fairy world where we completely disrupted the system in which indigenous people were living. Not all tribes, just like not all Europeans were just trying to colonize or whatever and take over people. Not all Native Americans were peaceful. The native tribes that we have today are the native tribes that even the pilgrims and the first settlers encountered in North America were the ones who had survived killing off other tribes. And one of the main reasons why many Native Americans were peaceful to European settlers was the European settlers had what they wanted, which was strength and power and firearms to go against the other tribes that were attacking them. So here's the thing, folks. Listen up. Mankind is mankind. All right, and we have not changed. It doesn't matter what our skin color is, where we're born, who we're married to, what we do in our bedroom. We still have selfish, greedy tendencies. And when that evil, when that darkness takes us over, we end up doing bad things. But the awesomest thing about being a person, which is another thing Hollywood will not tell you, is that we have a choice. We have a choice in doing the wrong thing or the right thing. How we know we have that choice is by the things we put in our brain and the things we write in our heart. And that comes from what we read, what we watch, and how we study history. So that's why having a moral compass, as they say, a moral backbone to tell you right and wrong is going to keep you from, being on the dark side or being on the light side. So that's just something important to remember as we're having this discussion. So first settlers came in 1607. Of course, the Spanish had already been, settling California and New Mexico, where I'm from. The Puritans, were actually outcasts. The Puritans were actually people who were suffering under King James I in England, because even though the nation was at large a Protestant nation, what happened was King James ended up doing exactly what the Roman Catholic Church had done, and he made himself as king, and many of them did afterwards, which is why we had a fight with them, is that the king was head of the church and the state, and so the church could do nothing unless the king said they could. And so that's a problem. Christianity and kings being over it doesn't mesh well, because Christianity preaches servitude and kindness and generosity and equality and these things that apply to everybody. But when a person puts themselves atop it and says, this is how I'm going to interpret it, that's how we get into all the trouble that we're into today. So the Puritans were trying to follow purity within the scripture written by the Jews about the Jewish Savior, Jesus Christ, who had come to not just save one nation of people and help them live a better life, but to save everybody. And the Puritans believed that God was the only king, that because of the laws he had written in scripture, that he's the only one who has the capacity, the omniscience to rule over us as people. The cool thing about God is he's not a king. He's not a dictator. He's not a tyrant. He gives you free will, and he loves you back, and he takes care of you, and you're more important to him than any discarded thing. But kings human kings will pick and choose who they care about because we're greedy. And once again, we think we can be God. So the Puritans were like, look, the king should not be over the church. God is over the church. And then with the Anglican church, there was beginning to be, fractions of interpretation, which is unfortunate, but that's the way it happens. But then they also were chaining the Bible to the church so that no common man could take it home and read it for himself. It had to be interpreted through the pastor, which we all have heard stories, and possibly many of us know that this is a bad idea, that people need to read it for themselves so that they can question it, they can ask other people, and yeah, if you're disbelieving and you don't care about the Bible, that's fine, but you should be able to read it and see for yourself, right? So that's what the Puritans thought. They also believed in a more common law for all men to be governed equally and not for there to be the crazy class system that was going on in England at the time. So people will say, oh, they weren't tolerant for Puritans because Puritans were fanatical. Not true. Maybe some of them were, but the majority of Puritans, a very small group, were like, you know what? We want to live somewhere where we can live out these biblical principles that say that God is the head of us and we listen to him and we are equal with our fellow man and we can raise our children to understand that rather than being forced into a religion that is governed by a king who actually doesn't care about his people. So they were really looking for religious freedom and even like human rights freedom, okay? Some of them, yes, were imprisoned for teaching these sort of things. And so they've split. So some Puritans said, we're going to stay in England and fight this. Some Puritans said, we're going to leave and we're going to go find another place and try to live more peaceably. So they actually did a little bit more of a biblical thing. Instead of rioting and trying to overthrow the government, they're like, you know what? The Bible says to live at peace with your neighbors the best you can. So we're going to go somewhere where our way of life can thrive. So they first went to Holland, where in Holland, the king wasn't the head of the church. They didn't follow Catholic law, even though they were, the world had turned to Protestantism. They're like, we're actually going to, go to Holland and live where there's religious freedom. We can practice how we want. But they were very English at the core, and there must have been things that they didn't appreciate about the Dutch, because after a decade or so, they're like, you know what? We didn't really move to Holland to become Dutch. We wanted to be Englishmen, but be Englishmen the way we want to be. Maybe that was the Puritans' first mistake, which instead of being okay with being Dutch and letting their kids grow up to be Dutch, because there's nothing wrong with being Dutch, maybe that purity went a little far and wanting to stay English. But you know what? You can't really blame them. Plus, we don't want to imagine extra details in history. That's where we get into fiction. That's where we get into fiction. And so many articles I've read today that talk about the Puritans was nothing but fiction, because people are like, well, we think that maybe they thought this, and maybe there was this problem, and then they did this, but we don't know, but we assume because... Shut up. That's not how you write a historical article piece. Anyways, so they believed in the gospel, not in the king being the head of the church, and they did have some success in Holland, but when time came that they could, charter a ship and go to the New World where there was plenty of room for people, they didn't think twice about it, and they decided to go, which this meant that they would have to charter a ship, hire a crew. And this Puritans, who became, which, pilgrim is an overall term for most settlers, but Puritan pilgrims first came to the U.S., to North America, 1619. Blech. I'm thinking of the movie and the Jericho, the TV show had Jericho established in 1624. I'm sorry. Puritan pilgrims in 1620 and 1621. They get there, and they're extremely ill prepared for the winter that they arrive in, and they end up staying on the ship for a very long time. But the problem is there's not just Puritans on the ship, because it was very expensive to charter a ship, and you had to get a lot of money together, and there were supplies, and da-da-da-da. So they were sharing the ship with many Anglicans and many non-religious peoples. Well, they're thinking about how they're going to survive in this new world on the coast of, near Plymouth. And they're like, well, we have to help each other. We have to help each other to survive. So we've got to create a charter, a covenant, a contract that we can all live under as equal and free without our religions getting in the way. Because I definitely think at this point, with how the Puritans were moving forward, many aspects of their faith was becoming religious, because that's what I think. But that's fiction. I don't know, perhaps. But it seems from the evidence that it was becoming more of a religious practice. So anyways, they get to Plymouth, and then, a lot of them like die in sickness and that, and they have the Mayflower Compact, which says that all men are equal and can, live under one common law, and that's how they land there. And then, of course, we have the tale of Squanto and Chief Massasoit and these different tribes that come in that help the Pilgrims. Yes, they help the Pilgrims, the Puritan Pilgrims, and the Puritan Pilgrims accept the help and create treaties, thanks to Squanto being able to speak English. And Squanto, and his different other names, maybe he had hidden agendas, maybe he didn't. He obviously went through a lot and still learned English and still helped these people regardless. Was it to elevate his status? Maybe. Or maybe it was, we don't know. We don't know the answer exactly to that. There's a few journal writings saying that Squanto let the power get to his head, but we don't know that exact. Sure, maybe. I don't know. And so Puritans, the point that I'm trying to make is the Puritans depicted in the Wednesday show and in Hollywood are these fanatical, like right-wing Christian people that are just awful, and they, be chaste and thee, thou, and da-da-da-da-da, and they go on about, and they're strict, and they're mean, and they're evil, and they don't want you to kiss anybody or touch anybody, and they're super superstitious, and they hate witches, and they want to burn everybody, and they're responsible for the indigenous genocide. Y'all, that isn't true. That isn't true. And you need to do the history research for yourself to find that out. Now, there are aspects and there are elements of that story that are true, as far as there being Puritans who were mean, who were maybe misogynistic, who were, mean to their wives, different things like that. But that's not the original intent of the Puritans, and that's not how many people live their lives. You remember at the beginning of this episode, I said to remember one thing. What was it? That negative and bad news and bad stories spread 6 times faster than the good ones. These snapshots that we have of history are just that, snapshots. And, history looking back on us is going to see a much clearer view of where everyone stands. But when looking back to those times that we didn't live through, we don't know anybody who lived through them to ask, we have to be very careful what we're spoon-fed, including careful what I'm telling you. And I love history very much, but I'm not going to call myself a historian or an expert on this. But I do encourage you to start looking into Christian history if you haven't, because Christians learn almost a completely different history than what secularists learn when it comes to these historic events. Even the first Thanksgiving, we don't promote it as like this big, happy, jolly, lucky sort of situation. And it wasn't until Abraham Lincoln wanted to proclaim a holiday that would unify us. And those kinds of things we understand, we learn. And it's through secularization of these important religious, historical, and societal moments that things start getting askew. It's just like Santa, which I hope to talk more about that in later views, but Thanksgiving is not a bad thing. It doesn't celebrate anything bad. In fact, the first Puritan pilgrims that would have had that very Thanksgiving, who also died of disease, who also died of stuff, who were getting imported foods from other countries that were bringing things, that's just the truth of it. It wasn't intentional to give everybody smallpox, and by no means. They died of it just as much as everybody else, seriously, think about it. When you look at all the failed settlements in the 1600s during the settling of North America. But that event of Thanksgiving and those pilgrims who were there at that moment in time, it would be a whole nother 50 years later till there started to become a ton of animosity and going back on those treaties that had happened with Pilgrims and Native Americans. A whole 50 years, which which people didn't live very long back then, in case you didn't know this. So a whole generation who had very specific principles, guided by their morality, guided by their religion, guided by their relationship with Jesus Christ, and created these treaties with Native Americans. Those people passed, and a whole new generation who grew up in religiosity and greed and many other issues started going back on these treaties, causing trouble. And that's what we have to remember, is that, disagreement is something that all humans have throughout history. And I know that many people will disagree with this video, which that's fine. Please keep a civil discussion down below and we can keep going with this. But my challenge is that when looking back in history, where it's portrayed in Hollywood, where it's portrayed in entertainment, don't just take that as the truth. Movies are not history. Movies are movies. They're fiction. They're escapism. And they are not going to be historically accurate. They can't even get historical fictitious fantasy worlds right. I mean, look at what's happened with Lord of the Rings and Wheel of Time and so many other shows. They can't even get that right, okay? So what makes you think that their portrait of Puritans and Pilgrims is going to be right at all? So now I'm going to rattle off some really awesome, epic Puritans. And you know who's first on the list? Solomon Kane. Solomon Kane is my boy. This is a wonderful collection of adventures and tales from Robert E. Howard about the sword-wielding avenger of Solomon Kane, who is a Puritan, a pilgrim, who starts off in England, and he is very dark and mysterious and brooding, kind of like a Wednesday Addams type of character, but he fights against evil and witches. It's a very graphic book. It's Robert E. Howard who wrote Conan, so it's going to be kind of brutal and savage. And Solomon Kane is just so dope. I know you can't read the title, but look at that guy. He looks so cool. And he just fights against demons and devils, and he travels from England to the darkest parts of Africa and frees people and works with people, and also, goes up against some excellent bad guys. And these stories are great. Another one you should look up, which is not a fictitious character, but William Bradford, all right? And also Elder Brewster and John Robertson and John Corner and so many more of that era. And look up what these men truly stood for, because it was freedom, freedom for religion, freedom of speech, and freedom from the tyranny of evil men and women who were governing different nations at the time. So that's it for Wednesday. Happy Wednesday. Thanks for watching this episode. Please like, share, and subscribe to hear more. I upload pretty much every Wednesday, and I hope you've enjoyed this very long, how did it get so freaking long, conversation about Wednesday Addams versus Puritans and Pilgrims, and I hope that you will tune in next week for my next video. Stay courageous.